She folded the letter twice before she let herself believe it was real, and even then, she wasn't sure she did. My name's not important yet. You'll have it in a minute, but I want you to picture her first. 28 years old. A seamstress's daughter from a flat little town in Ohio, where the rivers never froze all the way through. She was standing on a train platform in Wyoming territory with one trunk and a sewing basket that used to belong to her mother, and she was about to marry a man she had never met. That's not a figure of speech. That's just what the letter said. Her name was Adaline Renner, and everyone who'd ever bothered to shorten it called her Ada. She'd answered a notice in a paper 8 months back, a widower, a homestead. A wage for the season, pending the usual understanding, which was agency language for this could become a marriage if it works out for both of you. She hadn't cried reading it. She wasn't much of a crier. She'd read it twice, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket like it was a grocery list. The town she stepped into, Briar Hollow, they called it, though it wasn't much of a hollow and there wasn't a briar in sight, was smaller than the letter had made it sound. One street. A livery at the south end. A church at the north that looked like it hadn't decided if it was finished being built. The air smelled like pine sap and distant wood smoke, and the sky was that huge, pale October color that only shows up once the heat has finally let go of a place. 3 men were on the platform. The station master wasn't looking at anybody. A boy of about 12 was selling something out of a crate she didn't examine too closely. And a third man stood off by himself near a wagon, hat pulled low, hands in his coat pockets, watching the train instead of watching her. He looked, she thought, like a man come to collect a delivery he wasn't entirely sure he'd ordered. When she stepped down, he glanced over but didn't come to her. He waited. She crossed the platform herself. "You'd be the woman from the agency," he said, not a question, really. "I would." He looked at the trunk, he looked at the basket. "That all of it?" "Yes." He lifted the trunk into the wagon bed without asking if he could. She climbed up on her own before he could think to help her. His name, she'd learned before they'd gone half a mile, was Silas Thorne, and he did not waste words the way some men do when they're nervous. He simply didn't have many to spend in the first place. They rode out of town in the kind of silence that exists between two people who have agreed to something before they know each other. And neither one of them is sure yet what exactly they've agreed to. Here's the thing about that silence, though, it's the whole reason this story is worth telling. Because what grew out of that quiet wasn't going to be loud or fast or easy. It was going to be built the way you build a fence line, one post at a time, in weather that doesn't care whether you finish before dark. "About 4 miles out," he said, an hour or so into the ride. She nodded. "Hay needs cutting before week's end. Weather's holding, but it won't hold long." She said she understood. He looked at her sideways, quick, the way a carpenter checks a seam to see if it'll take weight. Then he looked back at the road and didn't say anything else for a long while. When the homestead finally came into view, cresting a low rise so it seemed to rise up out of the grass all at once, she saw a house gone the color of driftwood, a barn. A line of fence posts running east toward nothing, a garden plot someone had started and then abandoned to the weeds. A dog lifted its head from the barn door, decided the wagon wasn't worth the trouble, and lay back down. Silas pulled the team up and sat there a second with the reins loose. "It's not much to look at," he said. She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that would have helped either of them. Inside, the boy's name turned out to be Nathaniel, Nate mostly, when anyone bothered. And he wasn't there to greet them. He was down at the creek, Silas said, and would turn up when he was hungry. The house had a table, 2 chairs, a stove, a shelf with 4 tins on it, and a window that faced west with no curtain at all. Everything in that room had been placed by a man who knew how to be alone and had built his whole life around it. Bedrooms through there. "It's yours," Silas said, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "I'll be out in the barn till I get the side room finished. Figured you'd want to know that," he added, like an afterthought that wasn't really an afterthought at all. She said she appreciated it. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left her alone in a kitchen that hadn't heard a woman's voice in longer than either of them was going to say out loud. She didn't unpack that first night. She opened the trunk once, checked that nothing had shifted in transit, and shut it again. In the bedroom there was a narrow bed, a blue ceramic pitcher on the washstand. and a single nail on the wall with a rust stain in the shape of a small picture frame that had once hung there and didn't anymore. She didn't look at it long. She lit the stove instead, opened the 4 tins, salt, coffee, flour gone mostly to dust, and dried beans in the last one and made do. She ate alone at the table while the light went gold, then flat, then gone entirely. She washed her cup, folded the dishcloth over the basin rail the exact way she'd folded it every night for 4 years on her own, and realized only then that it had become a habit she didn't remember choosing. In the morning, she was up before the sun cleared the ridge. She heard his boots in the yard, the low groan of the barn door, and she built the fire back up and put coffee on, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the pot was there, and a man was working before the light was even full. She poured 2 cups. She carried one out and set it on the porch rail without calling to him. Then she went back inside and didn't watch through the window to see if he'd take it. She heard his boots cross the yard a while later, a pause at the step, and then the cup set back down empty and his boots heading back to the barn. That was the whole conversation. It would be most of their conversations, for a while. The dog took longer to warm to her than Sela's did. His name, she eventually learned, was Digger, which fit him about as well as a name can fit a dog, and for the first several mornings he watched her from a safe distance with the flat, unimpressed stare of an animal who'd already decided the household didn't need improving. It was Nate who broke that particular standoff, sneaking Digger scraps from his own plate when he thought no one was looking. Until one morning she found the dog sitting square in the kitchen doorway waiting for her the same way he waited for Sela's. Like he'd finally decided she counted as somebody worth waiting for. She didn't make a fuss over it. She just started saving him the fat off the salt pork, same as she did for anyone in that house who'd earned it. Now, before we go further, I want you to sit with that image a second, because it matters for what's coming. 2 strangers, tied together by a piece of paper and an agency's tidy handwriting, learning each other 1 cup of coffee at a time. If you've ever had to build trust with someone slowly, a little at a time, without ever quite naming what you were building, you already know where this is headed. Stay with me. She walked into town that first week with the empty flour tin tucked under her arm, and that's where she met Mrs. Holloway, who ran the dry goods store between the post office and a shuttered building with paper over its windows. Mrs. Holloway was somewhere in her 50s, thick through the shoulders, and she looked at the flour tin, and then at Ada's face the way a person does when they're deciding how much to ask and settling on nothing at all. She sold Ada 40 cents of flour, a small measure of beans, and slipped 3 apples into a twist of paper without charging for them. On the way to the door, Ada slowed near a shelf of hand-lettered seed packets, squash, beet, a pole bean she didn't recognize by name, and stood there a beat too long. He put a garden in east side of the house 2 years back, Mrs. Holloway said without being asked. Good son there, never came to much. Soil's fine, she added. Just nobody working it. Ada bought nothing more that day, but she carried that sentence home with her like it weighed something. She passed the shelf of hand-lettered seed packets 1 more time on her way out, slower than she needed to, and Mrs. Holloway watched her do it without a word, the way you watch someone reading a letter they haven't decided whether to answer. On the walk home, 20 minutes on the road, and then the long climb up the lane between the fence posts, she found herself doing the same arithmetic she'd catch herself doing again and again over the coming weeks. What a garden that size could actually produce if somebody worked it properly, and what it would mean, come winter, to have put up more than just enough to get by on. She hadn't decided yet if she was the somebody. She hadn't decided a lot of things yet. But she noticed she was already thinking in seasons instead of days, and that surprised her more than she let on, even to herself. She found a cracked spade in the lean-to, its handle wrapped in a strip of leather someone had tied on and never replaced, and she went to work on that abandoned garden plot herself. 2 seasons of neglect had sealed the ground over hard, and the first hour barely scratched it. Her shoulders burned. She kept going anyway. Sela's came around the corner near midday with a bridle he'd been mending, saw her at it, and went back inside without a word. When he came back out, the bridle was gone and he'd picked up the spade instead, working the row she'd started clean to the end without asking permission. She let him. She moved down and broke up the clods behind him with a short hoe. They worked like that in silence until the barn's shadow crossed the whole plot, and when he finally straightened up, he said, "Ground'll freeze in 6 weeks. Nothing's going in till spring." "I know that too," she said. He handed the spade back. She leaned it against the fence with the blade turned out so it wouldn't rust against the wood. He noticed. He didn't say so, but she saw him notice, and something about that small, wordless observation sat with her the rest of the afternoon. By the second week, young Nate had started following her out to the garden in the mornings, never quite close enough to look like he meant to, never far enough to be anywhere else. She let him believe the arrangement was accidental. One evening at the table, she found him hunched over a scrap of paper drawing a row of small circles with total concentration. "What's that?" she asked. He turned it toward her. "The beans." She looked at the drawing a moment. "You've got the spacing about right." He tried very hard not to look pleased about that, and failed completely, and added one more circle to the end of the row before going back to it. Later, sitting on the overturned bucket in the linta while she sorted seed, he told her, offhand, the way children hand you the heaviest things without meaning to, that his mother had grown beans. Once, Ada kept her hands moving. Was she good at it? He thought about that with real seriousness. "I don't know. I was small." She nodded and kept sorting, and he stayed on the bucket a while longer, and neither of them said anything else about it, but something in the room had shifted a little. The way a house settles after a hard winter, quiet, permanent, and mostly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Here's where I need you to pay attention, because this next part is where everything starts to turn, not with a declaration, not with anything anyone said out loud, but with dirt, with a fence line. With the kind of decision two people make about land when they've already, without quite admitting it, started making decisions about each other. By the third week, the test row of beans she'd planted at the field's eastern edge was showing. Pale split-leaf sprouts barely a finger's height above the soil. And better than 2 and 3 had taken. She stood at the end of that row one morning doing arithmetic in her head. Yield, market price, the difference between asterisk, just enough asterisk, and surplus. She didn't say any of it aloud. She was still deciding whether this place was one. She was building for a season or building toward something longer. That evening she walked out to the north fence line after supper and stood looking at ground that had never once been broken. The grass there was a different shade of green than anywhere else on the property, and that meant something underneath it. She just hadn't worked out what yet. Silas came out of the barn, saw her standing there, and didn't ask what she was thinking. He just came and stood beside her and looked at the same patch of ground she was looking at. Neither of them said anything for a long while, but it wasn't the silence of two strangers standing near each other out of politeness anymore. It was the silence of two people looking at the same thing and seeing more or less the same shape in it. She pointed once, low, toward the corner where the color changed. He looked where she pointed and nodded. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The next morning, before she'd even finished the breakfast dishes, he was already out at that fence line with the long-handled spade, cutting test squares into the sod. She dried her hands and went out to join him. The soil in his palm was dark and held together without crumbling, nothing like the pale, sandy dirt along the creek's side. "It'll need a channel before we break it," she said. "The hill draws close, maybe 40 feet of trench." "I can start it next week," he said. They started the trench on a Tuesday before sunrise. She'd already marked the line the evening before with small stones pressed into the soil, and when he walked it himself before touching a spade to it. He moved exactly one stone, 18 inches east, to avoid a shelf of buried rock he recognized by the way the ground sounded underfoot. She watched him do it and didn't ask how he knew. She just filed it away the way she filed most things about him now. He dug. She hauled the loosened soil to a low spot near the fence and built it into a berm to catch runoff later. Work she'd invented on her own the moment she saw him starting to fall behind. And never once announced she was doing. He adjusted his pace to match her trips without either of them saying a word about it. By mid-afternoon, they'd reached soil that was damper, darker, the place where the hillside's moisture gathered before it scattered off into nothing. She crouched at the trench edge, pressed her palm flat against the cut wall, and felt the cool coming off it. "We're in the right place," she said. He kept digging, but she saw him register it too. The way the cut face darkened, the way it held its shape clean instead of crumbling. She sat on the trench edge a minute, feet hanging in, watching swallows work the open field beyond the fence. "It was hay before the drought," she said. "The woman at the store told me." "The man before you tried it. He didn't get water to it," Silas said after a pause. "No," she said. "He didn't." They worked until the light went orange along the ground, and when she finally took the spade from him and he let her without protest. That told her something too, about how far they'd come from two strangers on a train platform, arguing silently about whether either of them was allowed to trust the other yet. If you've ever worked on something, a garden, a marriage, a friendship, where the real progress happens in the parts nobody's watching, you already know what this trench meant. It wasn't about water. It never really was. There was a moment near the end of that day that she thought about long after it had passed. A storm had been building out past the hills all afternoon, the kind that never quite arrives, but changes the color of everything anyway. And when the wind picked up and blew grit sideways across the open trench, Silas had stopped digging and looked at the sky the way a man looks at something he respects but isn't afraid of. "Won't reach us tonight," he'd said, mostly to himself. Nate had come running out from the direction of the creek just then, hair full of burrs, wanting to know if the storm was going to knock the barn down. And Silas had answered him with the same flat calm he answered everything with, "No, it wouldn't. Go get your boots off before your ma sees the mud you're tracking." He'd said your ma asterisk like it was a word he'd been carrying around for a while, waiting for a place to set it down. And it landed in the middle of that open field before either of them could take it back. Nate hadn't blinked at it. Ada hadn't either, not where anyone could see. She just kept hauling soil to the berm, a little faster than before, and if her face had done anything complicated in that moment, the wind covering the grit covered that too. "That night over beans and dried meat," he said out of nowhere, "the soil does hold differently out there." "It'll hold water the same way again," she said. "Once it remembers how." He looked up from his bowl. "You think it remembers? I think most things do," she said, "if you give them the right conditions." He didn't answer that, not in words. But he looked at her a moment longer than usual, not searching for anything, just noting it, the way a person does when something has landed somewhere it's going to stay. The harvest came in on an ordinary Thursday, except the weight of it wasn't ordinary at all. Silas borrowed the neighbor's good scale with the brass fittings, and they weighed the cut 3 separate times just to be certain the number wasn't a mistake. It wasn't. She wrote the figure into the ledger, and her pen stopped moving for just a second after she set it down, long enough that he saw it stop. And long enough that neither of them needed to say anything about that either. That evening, she didn't bring her notes to the table right away. She just sat a moment with her hands flat on the cloth, looking out at the dark shape of the field they'd built together out of nothing but stubbornness and 40 feet of trench. "You were right about the east parcel," he said, setting her cup down across from her. "The soil was always there," she said. "It just needed the time." He nodded slowly. Outside, something moved through the grass and went quiet again. "I was thinking about the northern edge," he said after a while, "for next year. The rocky part. That'll take longer," he said, not a question, not a worry. Just a man accounting for time in a way that assumes there's more of it coming. A way of speaking that only makes sense if you're already planning in seasons instead of weeks. "I know," she said. "All right," she said again, quieter. He refilled her cup without being asked. She pulled the ledger closer, opened it to the next blank page, wrote the date at the top in her small, even hand. And below it she wrote a single word, north, and underlined it once, and sat there a moment with the pen still in her hand. Looking at that word like it was a door she just decided to walk through. She hadn't said yes to anything out loud. Not yet, but some agreements don't get made in words. Some of them get made in trenches, and coffee cups left on porch rails, and a boy's drawing of a row of beans spaced just right. "So I want to ask you something before you go. If you'd stepped off that train not knowing a single thing about the man waiting for you, would you have stayed for the silence the way she did? Would you have trusted a fence line and a shared trench more than a conversation? Let me know where you're watching this from tonight, because I read every single one of those, and I love seeing how far this story travels. If this one got you, if you felt that quiet the way I did writing it, Do me a favor and hit like, subscribe if you're new here, and tell me in the comments what you would have done in her place. I'll see you in the next one.